In the humid jungles of Burma, the rain fell like sheets of molten glass. Steam rose from the ground, curling around the roots of ancient trees. It was 1943, and Japanese soldiers, thin, exhausted, and hardened by months of fighting, rested along a narrow ridge. Their tanks, squat Type 95 Hagos, sat below them in the mud, engines silent, their armor streaked with rust and vines. A strange sound echoed from beyond the tree line. Not the rumble of heavy treads, not the clank of armored steel, but a higher, almost cheerful whine. The soldiers turned. Through the haze appeared a small, box-shaped vehicle. Open-topped, no armor, a single star on its hood. The driver wore no helmet, just a cap, and beside him a soldier laughed as he steered. The Japanese men broke into laughter. "A toy," one said. "An American toy." Another joked that perhaps it was a farmer's cart, a civilian mistake brought to war. Compared to the hulking silhouette of a tank, it looked absurd, fragile, exposed, nothing but thin metal and four wheels. But the laughter didn't last long. The little machine stopped, reversed, then lunged forward. Its wheels dug deep into the mud, spraying thick clumps of earth behind it. Slowly, impossibly, it began to climb the ridge. Where the Japanese tanks had struggled, this tiny contraption climbed as if mocking them in return. It slipped, twisted, and kept going, inch by inch, until it crested the hill and rolled onto level ground, alive, unbroken, and unstoppable. The men below fell silent. For the first time, they saw a vehicle do something their own could not. They watched it disappear into the mist, carrying 2 American soldiers and a mounted machine gun, moving so easily it seemed to laugh at gravity itself. They had no name for it. The Americans called it the Willys Jeep. When it first appeared in the Pacific, many Japanese officers dismissed it entirely. How could such a small, flimsy car matter in a world of tanks, artillery, and aircraft? It was unarmored, unarmed, and so light that a group of men could lift it if it got stuck. Yet that was precisely its genius. The Willys Jeep wasn't built to destroy. It was built to endure. By the time those soldiers in Burma saw one for the first time, this vehicle had already crossed deserts in North Africa, ferried paratroopers in Sicily, and carried generals through battlefields from Tunisia to Tarawa. Its journey to that muddy ridge began years earlier, in a world that was not yet at war. In 1940, as the United States watched Europe collapse under German steel, the U.S. Army issued a desperate challenge to American industry. Design a light reconnaissance vehicle, 4-wheel drive, 1/4-ton payload, under 1,300 pounds, that could go anywhere a horse could go, and further. Only 3 companies dared to try: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Each was given mere weeks to produce a working prototype. Bantam went first, scraping together engineers and blueprints from thin air. But their design, though clever, couldn't be mass-produced. Willys came next, building something stronger, faster, and more reliable. The Model MB, powered by a 60-horsepower Go Devil engine that would become legendary. When the Army tested it, they found it could climb grades that defeated trucks, twice its size, ford rivers up to its headlights, and survive punishment that would shatter most machines. Its turning radius was tight enough for mountain paths, and its engine simple enough for soldiers to repair with a wrench and a rock. By the time America entered the war, the Jeep was ready. Factories roared across Ohio and Michigan. Assembly lines stretched like arteries of steel. Men and women in overalls bolted frames, tightened axles, painted olive drab over bare metal. Each one identical, each one destined for a different corner of the world. When the war ended, over 600,000 would be built. For the Americans who fought. In jungles, the Jeep was more than transport. It was freedom itself. It carried radios through flooded ravines, food through impossible trails, and wounded men back from the front. But for the Japanese, who relied on narrow, fragile supply routes and tanks designed for open ground, the Jeep was an enigma. How could something so small achieve what armor could not? They had built their own light reconnaissance vehicles, the Kurogane Type 95 among them, but few matched the Willys in power or endurance. Japanese engineers had built for precision, for hierarchy, for rules. The Jeep was built for improvisation. It was the embodiment of a philosophy. If it breaks, fix it. If it can't move, push it. If you need it to climb, it will find a way. And it would find many ways. In the months ahead, Japanese soldiers would see these little American machines scale riverbanks their tanks avoided, drive through minefields where no man dared step, and carry machine guns into positions no artillery could reach. They would come to call it, half in awe and half in resentment, the car that never stops. The irony was not lost on the men who once laughed. Years later, one captured officer admitted in his diary, "The American small car is everywhere. It goes up the mountain like a goat. It does not fear the mud." In a war of empires where giant steel beasts fought for dominance, it was this tiny, unarmored creature, the Willys Jeep, that proved a different kind of power. It conquered not through destruction, but through persistence, not by strength, but by will. And on that rainy ridge in Burma, as Japanese soldiers watched the little machine vanish into the mist, they realized something that would haunt them for the rest of the war. Sometimes, the simplest machine wins. The Willys Jeep's rise began long before it ever rolled into a battlefield. Its story was not born in gunfire, but in a government office, out of desperation, foresight, and a race against time. It was July 1940. Europe was burning. Hitler's armies had swept through France, and Britain stood alone, clinging to survival across the Channel. In Washington, American generals watched the fall of nations and realized how unprepared they were. Their motorized divisions were weak, their logistics outdated, and their reconnaissance still relied on motorcycles and horses, relics of a vanished war. So the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps issued a challenge: design and deliver a new kind of military vehicle. Light, fast, durable, four-wheel drive, able to carry 3 men and a mounted gun, all under 1,300 pounds, and do it in 49 days. It sounded impossible. But 3 companies stepped forward: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford Motor Company. The first contender, Bantam. Bantam was a small firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, better known for compact civilian cars than military machines. They were underfunded, understaffed, and outmatched by industrial giants. Yet, they were first to answer the Army's call. Working day and night, their chief engineer, Karl Probst, sketched blueprints in 5 days. Mechanics welded the first prototype from spare parts and borrowed components. On a crisp September morning, Bantam delivered their creation to the Army test field at Camp Holabird, Maryland, right on schedule. The little vehicle impressed everyone. It could climb 45-degree slopes, crawl through mud, and hit 50 miles per hour on open road. It was the first of its kind, a true 4x4 scout car. But Bantam was a small company. The Army doubted they could produce thousands quickly enough. Their design, however, had set the standard, and the competition was watching. The second challenger, Willys Overland. In Toledo, Ohio, Willys Overland engineers studied Bantam's blueprints. The Army had shared the plans with other bidders, hoping for improvements. Willys saw potential, but also problems. The Bantam was underpowered and fragile. Their answer was the Willys Quad, built around a new engine, the 60-horsepower Go Devil. It was raw, loud, and overbuilt, but it was strong. The Army tested it and found it could outperform everything else. The only issue? It was too heavy, but Willys refused to quit. They trimmed weight, strengthened the chassis, and redesigned the front grille into a simple, stamped steel pattern that could be mass-produced. When the final version rolled out, the Willys MB, it was perfect. Rugged, agile, and almost indestructible. The third giant, Ford Motor Company. Ford entered late, but their vast industrial muscle could not be ignored. They built their own version, the GPW, nearly identical to the Willys MB, using interchangeable parts. The result was extraordinary. 3 designs, 1 purpose, 1 machine. By late 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, the Army combined the best of all 3 and issued a final specification. The Willys MB would lead production. Ford would build under license to ensure supply, and so the American Jeep was born. What followed was one of the most remarkable feats of industrial mobilization in modern history. From 1941 to 1945, over 600,000 Jeeps would roll off assembly lines across America. To the men who built them, it wasn't just work. It was contribution to the fight. Every rivet, every bolt, every stamped plate was a small victory against tyranny. In the Willys plant at Toledo, sparks flew in every direction. Women in overalls lifted gearboxes onto conveyor belts. Foremen shouted over the roar of presses, stamping metal panels into the Jeep's unmistakable shape. The air smelled of oil and burnt steel. It was the sound of a nation rearming fast. At the Ford plants in Michigan, engineers perfected the process. They created assembly systems where Jeeps rolled out one every few minutes, each identical to the last. Each Jeep could be disassembled, crated, shipped overseas, and reassembled by soldiers in the field with nothing more than basic tools. That simplicity was its greatest weapon. The Willys Jeep was built not for comfort, but for trust. Its square body hid a soul of iron logic, nothing unnecessary, nothing weak. It had a low center of gravity that kept it stable on hills, leaf spring suspension that survived the roughest roads, and a transmission that shifted like a knife through butter. Soldiers would later say, "It never quit, even when we did." It could tow artillery, carry stretchers, pull tanks from ditches, and climb out of swamps. Its short wheelbase let it turn on narrow jungle trails where trucks bogged down. It could ford streams, climb rocks, and even run after losing a wheel. One war correspondent later wrote, "The Jeep is the war's mechanical miracle, a mule that eats gasoline instead of hay." And indeed, it became the modern mule, hauling generals, mail, ammunition, and hope across every front. As production soared, the Jeep took on another life. It began appearing in war posters, films, and training reels. GIs posed with them like pets. Commanders refused to go anywhere without one. Even General Eisenhower would later say that the Jeep, the Dakota airplane, and the landing craft were the 3 tools that won the war. Everywhere it went, it earned nicknames: Blitz Buggy, Peep, Puddle Jumper. But one name stuck, born from soldiers' slang and factory shorthand: Jeep. Some said it came from the letters GP for general purpose. Others believed it was inspired by the Popeye cartoon character Eugene the Jeep, a small creature that could go anywhere. Whatever its origin, the name fit perfectly. The Jeep could go anywhere, and it soon would. By the end of 1941, America was at war. Pearl Harbor had been attacked, and the Pacific was ablaze. The first convoys of Jeeps were already being shipped across the ocean, lashed to the decks of Liberty ships, their olive-drab bodies gleaming under tropical sun. They would land in the deserts of North Africa, in the mud of New Guinea, in the frozen forests of Europe. They would climb ridges, cross rivers, and haul the wounded through fire. And they would earn something no weapon could: affection. Because unlike the tank or the bomber, the Jeep was a companion. It was there in every battle, through every storm, beside every soldier. It had no armor, no turret, no guns. Yet it became the most loved machine of the war. And as it reached the jungles of the Pacific, it would soon face its greatest test, against an enemy who had never seen anything like it. The Japanese would laugh at first. Then they would learn what every American already knew: that this little machine, born from 49 days of desperation, had become unstoppable. By the spring of 1942, the Willys Jeep had already proven itself in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Europe. But its greatest challenge lay ahead, in the choking jungles and volcanic islands of the Pacific. There, the war was not measured in miles gained or tanks destroyed. It was measured in feet of mud, feet of progress through vine-choked ravines, and feet between life and death. The environment itself was an enemy: heat, rain, insects, and terrain so cruel it swallowed trucks whole. When the first shipments of Jeeps arrived at Guadalcanal in New Guinea, American soldiers looked at them skeptically. They had heard stories of the Jeep's strength, its toughness, but the jungles were merciless. Even tanks had been lost there, stuck in the swampy morass where nothing with wheels seemed to belong. Yet, as the first Jeep engines roared to life in those Pacific camps, a transformation began. The little machine that had crossed the deserts of Africa now faced mud so deep that men could drown in it. And it conquered it, not by force, but by finesse. Its low weight and four-wheel drive let it glide where heavier vehicles sank. Its broad tires bit into the soil, pulling it forward through sludge that had trapped entire convoys. Marines learned quickly: if you wanted something moved, you called for the Jeep. To the Japanese, who had relied on bicycles, pack animals, and narrow Type 95 tanks for movement, the Jeep seemed unnatural, almost absurd. In the Philippines and Burma, enemy soldiers first spotted the Willys crawling through terrain they themselves avoided. It was open-topped, unarmored, and loud. A prime target, they thought. But it didn't stop. When the tanks bogged down in soft ground, the Jeep kept climbing. When trucks broke axles on sharp coral ridges, the Jeep danced over them. Japanese intelligence officers began reporting small American cars appearing in impossible places: on slopes, behind lines, even in flooded rice paddies. They couldn't understand how such a vehicle could survive the jungle's brutality. At Guadalcanal, Marines discovered something remarkable. The Japanese often built defensive positions on ridges overlooking steep jungle valleys, believing no American vehicle could ever approach from below. But the Willys proved them wrong. In one engagement, a Marine platoon used Jeeps to haul a 30-70mm anti-tank gun up a muddy incline so steep that mules had been abandoned there earlier. Using ropes, pulleys, and the Jeep's own winch, they dragged the gun through terrain the Japanese considered impassable. By dawn, the weapon was in position. When the first shells fell, the defenders were stunned. They had never imagined a gun could reach that ridge. The report in a Japanese unit diary simply read, "Enemy vehicle appeared from the ravine. Impossible terrain. No explanation." From then on, the Jeep became a weapon of psychological warfare as much as mobility. In the dense jungles of New Guinea, Japanese troops learned to listen for the high, distinctive hum of the Willys engine, a sound that meant the Americans were coming, even where no road existed. For soldiers who had been trained to fight in predictable terrain, the Jeep represented chaos, unpredictable, everywhere at once. In one notorious encounter during the Bunagona campaign, A jeep convoy carrying ammunition pushed through a flooded coconut grove to reach a cutoff platoon. The Japanese, watching from across the swamp, laughed as the small vehicles splashed into waist-deep water. But as minutes passed, disbelief replaced laughter. The jeeps did not stall. They floated forward, exhausts bubbling, wheels clawing for grip until they reached the opposite bank. The stranded Americans cheered. The Japanese fell silent. The jeep wasn't just transport. It became lifeline, artillery mule, and ambulance. When wounded men needed evacuation through rain-soaked trails, jeeps became field ambulances. Their rear seats removed, stretchers strapped across the back. Soldiers later said that the sight of a jeep bouncing toward them meant survival. When radios needed power, jeeps became mobile communication centers. When engineers needed to lay cables, jeeps unspooled wire from their bumpers. It seemed there was nothing this tiny vehicle couldn't be turned into. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced growing frustration. Their Type 95 Hago tanks, once symbols of mobility, performed poorly in the same conditions. The narrow tracks sank into soft soil, engines overheated, and spare parts were scarce. The jungle that devoured Japanese armor seemed to bend before the Willys Jeep. Captured Japanese officers later admitted they had underestimated the vehicle. One wrote, "The American car is very small, but it goes where we cannot. It climbs hills like a monkey and swims like a fish." In the Philippines, a captured Jeep provided an opportunity for study. Japanese engineers examined its design and were struck by its simplicity. The frame was minimal, the engine compact, and the four-wheel drive ingenious. One report noted with frustration, "There are no complicated parts. Any soldier can repair it." They found it almost primitive, and that was precisely why it worked. The Jeep didn't need factories, fuel depots, or special roads. It needed only men with determination and a few gallons of gasoline. It reflected the American approach to war itself. Simple, flexible, relentless. In the Pacific campaigns that followed, the Jeep became more than a machine. It became a symbol. It represented the American belief that obstacles were only challenges waiting to be solved. When a Jeep bogged down in a river, soldiers didn't curse. They pushed. When it broke, they fixed it with wire, tape, or the handle of a shovel. The vehicle's stubborn endurance mirrored their own. In time, even the Japanese soldiers who once mocked it came to respect it. They saw it everywhere. Moving ammunition through night rain, pulling artillery over mountains, ferrying officers through jungles no tank could navigate. To them, it was no longer a toy. It was a ghost, appearing where no vehicle should exist, surviving what none should survive. By 1943, the laughter had stopped. The Jeep had become part of the legend of the Pacific War. It carried stretchers off bloody beaches, hauled supplies up mountain trails, and brought commanders like MacArthur and Kruger to the front lines. It fought typhoons, rivers, and terrain, and it never complained. One Marine later said, "You could trust a Jeep like a friend. You gave it everything, and it always brought you home." Even the enemy came to measure time by its arrival. "We heard the small car," one Japanese private recalled after the war, "and we knew the Americans were near." The war in the Pacific would grind on for years, but the small Willys Jeep had already done something extraordinary. It had erased the line between man and machine, soldier and companion. Where the tanks failed, it had triumphed. Where the enemy mocked, it had inspired fear, and in every muddy jungle and smoking battlefield, it whispered the same quiet promise: nothing is impossible. By late 1943, the Willys Jeep was no longer a curiosity. It had become an extension of the American soldier, as vital as his rifle. Everywhere it went, it reshaped how armies thought about movement, supply, and survival. In the Pacific jungles, where logistics had once strangled campaigns, The Jeep offered something no tank, truck, or mule could: freedom. It wasn't the strongest vehicle in the war. It wasn't the fastest. But it was the most adaptable. And that made it unstoppable. The U.S. Army quickly recognized what it had created. Not just a machine, but a doctrine. The Jeep changed how commanders planned. Before its arrival, an infantry platoon could move only as fast as its feet. The moment a trail turned to mud, or the rain washed away a bridge, progress stopped. But the Willys could thread through vines, climb loose slopes, and cross ravines with an ease that astonished even engineers. Generals began redesigning battlefield strategy around it. They used Jeeps as forward reconnaissance, running ahead of larger columns to map out terrain and spot enemy positions. Scouts would drive into places once considered unreachable: narrow ridgelines, dried riverbeds, steep escarpments, returning with precise intelligence. What used to take hours on foot now took minutes. The Jeep had turned reconnaissance into rapid maneuver warfare, and in the Pacific, that was revolutionary. Japanese commanders soon realized the danger. Their light tanks, once considered symbols of mobility, couldn't compete. The Type 95 Heigo, Japan's most common light tank, looked fierce on paper. It carried a 37mm gun and thin armor. Enough to handle infantry, perhaps, but not the landscape. Its narrow tracks cut deep into the jungle mud. Its engine, air-cooled and underpowered, choked in the humid air. It could move only on prepared ground. On wet slopes or coral paths, it was helpless. American units watched as Heigo stalled on inclines or sank up to their hulls in swamp water. Sometimes, a single Jeep would pass the immobilized tank, weaving through the trees, climbing out of ditches, taunting the enemy with mobility they could only dream of. The irony was bitter. Japan had built machines to dominate the Pacific, but the Pacific belonged to the Jeep. The difference lay not just in mechanics, but in philosophy. Japanese military design emphasized rigidity. Vehicles had a defined purpose, a defined terrain, a defined order. American design valued improvisation. If it worked, use it. If it didn't, adapt it. The Willys Jeep was the embodiment of that belief. It could be anything a soldier needed: ambulance, supply truck, gun platform, command post, or even a field kitchen. In one photograph from New Guinea, a Jeep is shown carrying a radio set, a wounded man, 3 Marines, and a Browning machine gun, all at once. Every Jeep was a blank canvas. Soldiers modified them endlessly, bolting armor plates from scrap metal, mounting machine guns on pipes, adding canopies made from tent cloth, even welding brackets for bazookas or flamethrowers. It was the Army's most democratic weapon, shaped by the hands of its users. One of the Jeep's greatest assets was its ability to climb. It could scale 45-degree slopes, crawl over boulders, and cross trenches 2 feet deep. It could handle sharp turns in trails barely wider than itself, thanks to its 80-inch wheelbase. Its low center of gravity meant it almost never flipped, even on slopes that terrified drivers. A single lever engaged its 4-wheel drive, distributing power evenly across all axles. Soldiers said it felt alive, like it wanted to move forward no matter what stood in its way. In contrast, the Japanese tanks, with their narrow tracks and limited suspension, often broke down when forced off roads. Mechanics struggled to repair them in the field. The Jeep, by contrast, could be fixed with a hammer, a wrench, and determination. A broken fan belt? Use a piece of rope. A flat tire? Wrap it in burlap and drive anyway. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a philosophy that nothing stops us. As the Jeep's reputation grew, so did its psychological power. Japanese soldiers began reporting that American columns were appearing faster than expected, even across impassable terrain. Patrols would vanish into the jungle and reappear hours later in places the enemy thought unreachable. The Jeep had erased distance. In a war fought in inches, that was devastating. At Bougainville, Jeeps hauled mortars through swamps to flank Japanese positions that had believed themselves protected by terrain. At Cape Gloucester, they towed artillery up muddy ridges under fire, keeping the guns rolling while enemy tanks spun uselessly below. To the Americans, it felt like magic. To the Japanese, it looked like defiance of nature itself. By 1944, the Willys had transformed from simple transport into a weapon of movement. Armored divisions in Europe called it the battlefield spider. In the Pacific, Marines gave it a different nickname, the jungle ghost. Its sound was distinctive, a quick, rhythmic hum that echoed across the trees. Soldiers said they could tell the difference between a jeep and any other vehicle by ear. To friendly troops, that hum meant supplies, rescue, or reinforcement. To the enemy, it meant the Americans were coming. Again. In war, perception is power. The Jeep carried both. The Japanese tried to match it. They built a few light four-wheel drive trucks, inspired by captured models, but production was slow and resources scarce. None matched the Willys' reliability. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and spare parts vanished with each lost island. In contrast, American Jeeps arrived by the thousands, shipped in crates, dropped by parachute, even landed on beaches wrapped in waterproof canvas. Soldiers could assemble one in hours. By the time it roared to life, it was already part of the unit, part of the family. Every soldier trusted it. Commanders rode into battle standing in them. Field medics used them to reach the dying. Engineers relied on them to tow cables. And chaplains used them as mobile altars. It could do everything except quit. A Marine sergeant in New Britain later recalled, "We had a saying, the Jeep will make it, or we'll carry it the rest of the way. But it'll make it first." He wasn't wrong. Across the Pacific, on every jungle trail, the Willys Jeep had proven something profound. In modern warfare, speed, flexibility, and trust were stronger than armor and firepower. The Japanese tanks might have looked powerful, but they couldn't adapt. The Jeep could, and that was why it won. By the end of 1944, the Jeep had earned a reputation no general could command and no enemy could deny. It was the pulse of every operation, the first to arrive and the last to leave. It climbed mountains that broke tanks, forded rivers that drowned trucks, and carried hope where only despair should have lived. Even the enemy, who once mocked its size, began to see it differently. To them, it was proof that the American strength was not in machines, but in the spirit behind them. The Willys Jeep was more than steel and rubber. It was movement itself, relentless, loyal, unyielding, and its legend was just beginning. By 1944, the Willys Jeep had become more than a tool of war. It was a companion, a faithful, stubborn, loyal presence that shared the soldier's burdens and his silence. In every theater of war, from the beaches of Saipan to the mountains of Luzon, Jeeps bore the same scars as the men who drove them. Bullet holes patched with tin, fenders dented from shrapnel, dashboards etched with names. Soldiers gave them nicknames as if they were living beings: Betsy, Blondie, Dead-End Kid, Little Texas. Each one had a story. Each one had a personality. To the men who fought in the Pacific, the Jeep was part of the squad. It didn't just move them, it was them. They trusted it to start in the morning after a night of rain. They trusted it to climb the last ridge when their legs gave out. They trusted it to bring them home, even when home was just another muddy camp beside a river that smelled of diesel and death. One Marine remembered it simply. The Jeep was like your buddy. It took the hits and kept going. It didn't talk back. It just went wherever you asked it to, even if it killed itself doing it. In the Pacific, Jeeps became multi-purpose miracles. There were no manuals for what soldiers did with them. Improvisation was survival. Mechanics turned them into field ambulances, removing the back seats and strapping stretchers across wooden frames. Others converted them into gun platforms, welding mounts for .30 and .50 caliber Brownings. Some became radio jeeps, with antenna wires stretching into the canopy like spider legs. A few were even turned into makeshift bulldozers, with steel plates bolted to the front to clear debris or push wreckage off trails. There was no limit to what a jeep could become, and no limit to what a soldier would make of it. The bond between man and machine deepened not from comfort, but from shared hardship. The Jeep had no roof, no doors, no armor. Its seats were thin canvas, its windshield often folded down. Rain fell directly on the driver's lap, dust coated his skin, and wind burned his eyes. Yet, soldiers loved it. Perhaps because the Jeep was honest. It didn't pretend to protect them. It didn't hide behind steel or promise invincibility. It shared their exposure, the cold, the mud, the danger. When they huddled beneath ponchos during monsoon storms, so did it. In a war filled with complex machines that broke, jammed, and disappointed, the Jeep never lied. It said, "I'll get you there. Nothing more, nothing less." And it always did. There was an unspoken ritual among drivers. They learned every sound the engine made, every rattle, every sputter, every cough of the go-devil motor. They could tell, by ear alone, when the carburetor needed cleaning or when a tire was soft. They became mechanics by instinct. With no spare parts, they patched holes with flattened tin cans, replaced belts with shoelaces, and tied broken springs with wire pulled from ration crates. Some carried small toolkits. Others carried nothing but a wrench, a knife, and faith. The Jeep seemed to reward that faith. Even half-broken, it found a way to move. A veteran of the 25th Infantry later wrote, "When you turned the key, you were talking to it, asking for one more favor, and it always said, yes." In the Philippines, a Jeep nicknamed Lulu Bell became a legend among medics. It was riddled with bullet holes, its frame twisted from shrapnel. Yet, for 6 months, it carried wounded men out of enemy fire until finally a mortar shell destroyed it. The men it saved painted its name on a new Jeep the next day. To them, Lulu Bell had earned immortality. Another story came from Bougainville, where a unit's Jeep, Sweet Sue, was lost to rising floodwater. When the rains stopped days later, the men found it a mile downstream, upright, engine half submerged, headlights still intact. They drained the oil, cleaned the plugs, cranked the engine, and Sweet Sue started again. Stories like these spread across the Pacific like folklore. Even commanders grew attached. General Douglas MacArthur had his own Jeep, polished to a shine, used for frontline visits. General George Patton, ever the showman, fitted his with ivory-handled pistols and a siren. General Eisenhower simply called it indispensable. But among the rank and file, affection for the Jeep came from humility. It wasn't a symbol of rank. It was the great equalizer. Officers and privates rode side by side in it, the same mud splattering both. A Marine corporal once said, "There were no generals in a Jeep, only drivers and passengers. It made everyone the same height." In an age when tanks were worshipped as gods of war, the Jeep became the soldier's best friend. It carried them through hell, not above it, but with them. It brought mail from home, hauled stretchers to field hospitals, and ferried chaplains into foxholes. It pulled stuck trucks, carried barrels of water, and even served as the altar for battlefield prayers. In the calm after battle, soldiers leaned against its fenders to smoke, to rest, to talk about nothing. It was always there, a silent witness to their exhaustion and their hope. Some men carved initials into the dashboard. Others painted pin-up girls or slogans across the hood, small reminders of life beyond the war. In a way, the Jeep absorbed their humanity. It carried not just men and supplies, but stories, laughter, fear, and memory. As the campaigns dragged on, the Jeep became part of the landscape. Photographs show them covered in mud, half buried in vines, headlights staring like weary eyes. Yet still they moved, always forward, never complaining. To the Japanese, this persistence was incomprehensible. Their vehicles were designed for precision and perfection. The American Jeep survived on imperfection and willpower. One captured. Japanese engineer wrote in astonishment, "Their car looks crude, but it never stops. We repair ours often. They do not. Still, theirs runs." When the war finally ended, many soldiers couldn't bear to leave their Jeeps behind. Some tried to ship them home. Others buried them in shallow pits, marking the spot on maps they'd never use again. To those men, the Jeep wasn't a vehicle. It was a friend who had shared every mile. One Marine said it best, "I've driven officers, wounded, and ghosts in that thing. It deserves a medal more than I do." The Willys Jeep was the war's quietest hero. It never fired a shot, but it carried more courage, more pain, and more lives than any weapon on the field. And for the men who trusted it with their lives, it was not made of metal, but of memory. The Jeep had become something rare in war, a machine that felt human. By 1944, the Willys Jeep had conquered the beaches, the jungles, and the swamps. But its greatest test came not from enemy fire, but from the mountains. And in those mountains, it earned its legend. In Burma, the Allied campaign was unlike any other. It wasn't a war of front lines or grand offensives. It was a war of endurance against disease, heat, leeches, and landscapes that swallowed armies whole. British, American, Chinese, and Indian troops struggled to move through a green labyrinth of ridges and gorges, where each mile took days to cross. Horses died, trucks failed, even tanks, with all their weight and pride, could go no further than the first hill. But the Jeep kept climbing. When General Joseph Stilwell and General Ord Wingate began their deep penetration operations behind Japanese lines, they faced an impossible question. How do you move men, weapons, and supplies through mountains that break machines? The answer came on 4 small wheels. The Willys Jeep, already famous for its endurance, was now pushed beyond its design. It was stripped down, modified, and reforged for the Burmese wild. Its mission was not just transport, it was survival. Merrill's Marauders, the American long-range jungle unit, depended on the Jeep for everything. They hauled mortars, radio sets, ammunition, and the wounded. When a trail ended, they didn't stop. They dismantled the Jeeps piece by piece, carried them over hills on bamboo poles, and reassembled them on the other side. It sounded insane, but it worked. The terrain was brutal. Sheer slopes cut by waterfalls, trails so narrow that a Jeep's tires hung over the edge. The rain never stopped. Thick, suffocating rain that turned the soil into liquid clay. At times, the engines drowned, but with a few minutes of tinkering, a handful of soldiers would drain the carburetors, dry the plugs, and start again. The Willys would cough, sputter, and roar back to life, as if insulted by the mountain's challenge. There were days when men doubted they could go any farther. But the Jeep didn't. It climbed, always climbed. One marauder recalled, "It wasn't the food, or the guns, or the maps that kept us going. It was that little car. We saw it crawl up a ridge that broke the backs of mules. We started believing we could do the same." The Jeep gave them more than movement. It gave them morale. In the British Chindit units under Wingate, the Jeep was treated like a comrade. The Chindits were masters of deep penetration warfare, living for months behind enemy lines. They built hidden bases, struck supply lines, then vanished into the jungle. Their Jeeps were their lifelines. They carried radios to call in airdrops, guns for defense, and wounded men for evacuation. When a bridge collapsed or a track vanished, the Chindits didn't retreat. They cut new paths. Accounts tell of Jeeps being winched up cliffs by hand, using pulleys and vines. In one operation, a column of Jeeps crossed a gorge by laying bamboo under their tires and crawling inch by inch across a temporary bridge that sagged under their weight. To anyone watching, it defied belief. To those inside, it was simply what the Jeep did. The Japanese, who had dismissed the American vehicle as a novelty, began to view it with a kind of fearful respect. Captured diaries mention the small American car that could climb like a mountain goat. One officer, stationed in northern Burma, wrote with disbelief, "We heard the sound of the small car in the rain. We did not believe it could come up that road. Then we saw it. It was like a spirit, covered in mud, but still moving." The irony was deep. Japan's army, built on the idea of discipline and order, found itself fighting a machine that embodied chaos. A machine that broke every rule and survived. The secret to its climbing power wasn't magic. It was design. The Jeep's 80-inch wheelbase gave it balance. Its low center of gravity made it nearly impossible to roll. The leaf spring suspension, simple and tough, absorbed punishment no luxury car could dream of taking. And its four-wheel drive, engaged with a single lever, distributed power to all corners like a living muscle. Its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine didn't sound like much, but it produced enormous torque, the kind needed to pull itself and a trailer full of ammunition up a hill that would stop a tank. Its lightness was its strength. While the Japanese Hago tank sank into the mud under its own weight, the Jeep floated over it. While heavy trucks cracked their frames on rocky trails, the Willys flexed and survived. It was not brute force that conquered the mountains, it was cleverness. There's a story from the Hukong Valley that soldiers still tell. A Jeep, loaded with wounded men, faced a ridge so steep that even mules refused to climb it. The driver, a young corporal from Kansas, refused to turn back. He shifted into low gear, gripped the wheel, and inched forward. The Jeep slid sideways, its rear tires spinning, then caught traction and lunged upward. When it reached the top, the wounded men cheered. One of them said softly, "That thing's got more soul than all of us." That moment became legend. Even the terrain could not destroy the Jeep's spirit. When rain turned trails into rivers, Jeeps formed convoys that chained themselves together with ropes, hauling each other forward through the flood. When bridges collapsed, they crossed streams on felled logs. When engines overheated, soldiers cooled them with canteens of precious drinking water, then drove on without complaint. In one extraordinary instance, Jeeps were used to pull an entire anti-aircraft gun up a ridge overlooking the Mayatkina airfield, a climb so steep that local villagers swore it couldn't be done. The gun arrived at dawn, and within hours, Japanese aircraft flying overhead were shot down by a weapon, delivered by a machine. The enemy had mocked as a toy. The Willys Jeep became the mountain's equal. It taught soldiers something profound, that adaptability was greater than strength, that persistence outlasted perfection. In Burma, where maps lied and nature ruled, the Jeep became a symbol of willpower. Every man who drove one learned that no obstacle was final. When it broke, they fixed it. When it sank, they pulled it out. When it rolled, they set it upright, wiped off the mud, and drove again. No one had to order them to, because by then they weren't driving a vehicle. They were continuing a promise. Years later, veterans would still talk about those climbs, about the sound of the engine echoing off jungle walls, about the moment when the Jeep's nose tipped skyward, wheels spinning, refusing to surrender. In a war of technology and destruction, the Jeep's greatest victory was moral. It proved that simplicity, courage, and cooperation could overcome even the tallest mountains. One marauder wrote home after the campaign, "We didn't conquer Burma. The Jeep did. We just followed it up the hill." By the end of the campaign, the Jeep had done the unthinkable. It had crossed mountains where no vehicle was meant to go. It had delivered guns, medicine, and hope to men who had nothing left but endurance. And when the last convoys rolled out of the jungle, engines coughing, bodies soaked, flags torn, the Willys Jeep rolled beside them, scarred but undefeated. It had become more than a machine. It was a spirit made of steel, oil, and stubbornness, the very soul of Allied perseverance. The Japanese called it a mountain ghost. The Americans simply called it the Jeep. The Pacific War was often described as a battle of machines, ships, planes, tanks. But history would prove that the smallest machine often mattered most. The Japanese Empire entered the war with confidence in its engineering. Its army believed mobility and firepower could be balanced through light tanks, compact vehicles, and strict logistical discipline. In theory, their armored divisions were agile, efficient, and suited to Asia's narrow roads. In reality, the Pacific destroyed that illusion. The jungle was not a battlefield. It was a living trap. The vines strangled, the soil swallowed, the rain turned roads to rivers. It punished anything that relied on weight or perfection. Japanese tanks, once seen as the sharp edge of modern warfare, became victims of the very terrain they hoped to dominate. The most common of these was the Type 95 Heigo, a light tank designed in the 1930s. On open plains, it was fast and elegant, a three-man vehicle capable of 30 miles per hour. But it had been built for China's wide roads and dry fields, not for the choking jungles of the Pacific. Its armor was thin, so thin that rifle fire sometimes dented it. Its main gun, a 37mm cannon, was useless against bunkers or enemy armor, and its narrow tracks gave it poor grip in soft soil. Japanese doctrine emphasized defense. Tanks were to support infantry, not operate independently. That meant they depended on roads. But in New Guinea, Luzon, and Burma, roads were illusions. The Americans and their allies understood this sooner than anyone. They didn't need to outgun Japan. They needed to outmove it. And that's what the Willys Jeep did. While the Heigo's engine seized in humidity and its armor rusted in the rain, the Jeep thrived in the same conditions. It had no armor to corrode, no heavy treads to sink, and no need for fuel depots. It drank whatever gasoline it was given and kept going. Its small Go Devil engine, simple as a tractor's heart, laughed at the mud. Where Japanese tanks waited for dry weather, the Jeep plowed forward in storms. Where bridges collapsed, it found fords. Where roads ended, it made its own. The difference was more than mechanical. It was philosophical. Japanese war industry followed rigid hierarchies. Designs were approved slowly, and innovation was cautious. When something broke, it was replaced by the same flawed design. The American system, by contrast, was built on adaptation. Soldiers in the field modified their Jeeps daily. They welded gun mounts, bolted extra storage, rigged trailers from scrap, and invented on the move. No permission needed, just results. That freedom gave the Allies an edge the Japanese could never match. By mid-1944, captured reports from Japanese officers reflected growing frustration. One memo from Burma read, "Enemy's small cars move freely in terrain inaccessible to our vehicles. They ascend steep hills and cross streams without aid. Our tanks cannot follow." In the same period, American units were using jeeps to pull artillery over trails where Japanese tanks had broken down and been abandoned. The jeep was no longer just transport. It had become a psychological weapon. Japanese troops began associating its sound with encirclement. If they heard the whine of a Willys engine behind them, it meant their flank was gone. In the Philippine mountains, one platoon of jeeps outflanked a Japanese column by climbing a goat path the enemy had deemed impassable. They opened fire from behind, using mounted .30 caliber guns. The Japanese tank crews, unable to turn or retreat, were trapped by machines that weighed 1/10 as much, but moved 10 times as fast. Mobility had beaten armor. The jeep's tactical value lay in its unpredictability. It could appear anywhere, anytime. One day it was hauling wounded through a swamp. The next, it was ferrying officers across a volcano slope. Its silhouette, small, square, and fearless, became an icon of inevitability. Even Japanese propaganda, which once mocked it, began to acknowledge it as a difficult enemy vehicle. Captured Japanese mechanics marveled at its simplicity. The Americans build machines like children build toys. Simple, but they do not break. They were right. The Jeep was built to survive by being uncomplicated. While Japanese tanks required skilled crews and constant maintenance, any soldier could drive a Jeep, repair it, and keep it alive. It was democracy on wheels. And then there was logistics, the true battlefield of the Pacific. Every mile of jungle road devoured fuel, time, and lives. The Japanese supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to air raids and mudslides. Their tanks and trucks sat idle for want of spare parts. Meanwhile, the Jeep multiplied like ants. Thousands were shipped by sea, crated in pieces, then reassembled by field units. They could be parachuted, hoisted onto barges, or lashed to cargo nets on transport planes. Some were dropped by parachute with little more than a canvas wrap for protection, and still started on the first turn of the key. One carried its own legacy. As an officer in the U.S. 41st Division wrote after the Philippines campaign, "The Jeep moved where fuel could not be carried, where tanks could not roll, and where men alone could not endure." In contrast, Japan's mechanized divisions became prisoners of their own design. Their tanks were stranded by terrain, their trucks by weather, their horses by hunger. By 1945, the Imperial Army was retreating on foot, their vaunted machines rusting beside the trails. The Willys Jeep, meanwhile, was everywhere, rolling across beaches, through rivers, over ruins. It had not just outlasted Japan's armor, it had outthought it. The irony was unmistakable. Japan had built tanks to win the war of machines. America had built a small car to carry men, and ended up winning that war instead. When captured, Japanese officers were shown American motor pools. After the war, many stared in silence. One engineer whispered, almost reverently, "We built machines to fight. They built machines to endure. That is why they won." He wasn't wrong. The Jeep's triumph over Japan's armored philosophy revealed something larger. The future of warfare wasn't size or strength. It was adaptability. In the post-war years, nations would chase that lesson, building lighter, faster, more flexible vehicles modeled after the Willys Jeep. But in 1944, that revelation was born in the mud and fire of the Pacific, when one small American machine proved that willpower and imagination could outfight even an empire's steel. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, thousands of their tanks lay rotting across Asia, silent memorials to a flawed vision of power. The Jeeps, however, were still running, Some carried soldiers home. Others were turned into mail trucks or field ambulances for the wounded left behind. Many were handed to local forces, who drove them for years after the war ended, and every one of them carried the same message, written not in words, but in tire tracks across impossible terrain. It isn't the size of the machine that wins the war. It's the spirit that drives it. By late 1944, even the Japanese could no longer ignore the small American vehicle that had rewritten the rules of mobility. At first, they mocked it. Then they feared it. Finally, they tried to use it. Across the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, the empire's supply lines were collapsing. Airfields fell one after another. Convoys burned on the seas, and fuel was running out. The Japanese army, once known for its strict mechanical order, now relied on improvisation, scavenging whatever it could find from the wreckage of war. Among the most prized trophies were the Willys Jeeps, captured during ambushes or found abandoned after American advances. These small machines became curiosities in Japanese camps. The first reports described them with fascination. A light four-wheel vehicle, easily repaired, moves in all terrain, superior to our Kurogane cars. Mechanics and engineers gathered around them like archaeologists examining an artifact. They expected complexity, but found simplicity instead. No hidden wiring, no delicate assemblies. Just a clean engine, a tough frame, and the kind of logic that made repair a matter of common sense. One captured mechanic is said to have exclaimed, "It is as if a farmer designed it, not an engineer." And he meant it as a compliment. Japanese workshops in the Philippines began refurbishing captured Jeeps for their own use. Some were painted dark green, marked with white characters, and fitted with makeshift wooden seats. Others were cannibalized for engines, tires, or radios. A handful were even modified with Japanese flags draped across the hood, to fool Allied aircraft that might otherwise strafe them from above. Ironically, many of these captured Jeeps were used in the same way the Americans had, hauling supplies, towing guns, evacuating wounded. In some places, they replaced entire convoys of broken-down trucks. In the words of one Japanese lieutenant, "We took their car and made it our own." But it did not obey us as it obeyed them. That line, half admiration, half superstition, captured the strange respect the Willys had earned. The captured Jeeps did more than serve. They taught Japanese engineers, studied them carefully, reporting their findings back to the homeland. They noted the short wheelbase, the flexible suspension, and the efficiency of the four-wheel drive. They admired the simplicity of the transmission and the fact that no specialized tools were needed to strip the entire vehicle apart. In 1945, one field report from Burma recommended the development of a similar light vehicle suitable for rough terrain and jungle operation. It was a late realization, but a prophetic one. The truth was, Japan had never built anything quite like the Willys Jeep. Before the war, it had developed the Kurogane Type 95, a small three-seater scout car used by officers and couriers. It was the world's first mass-produced four-wheel drive vehicle, predating even the Willys. But while ingenious for its time, it was fragile, slow, and expensive to maintain. The Kurogane's engine required skilled care, and spare parts were scarce. It could handle flat roads but faltered in deep mud or steep climbs. The Jeep, by contrast, was the Kurogane's evolution, perfected by necessity and industrial power. Its strength lay not in innovation, but in refinement. And refinement was what wartime Japan lacked. As the tide of war turned, captured Jeeps became both a symbol and a tool of survival. In the closing months of the conflict, small Japanese units trapped on islands often used captured American equipment to blend in or retreat. A few even attempted deception, painting Jeeps with false U.S. markings to ambush advancing troops. But these efforts rarely succeeded. The Jeep's hum, its rhythm, its smell. American soldiers could recognize them instantly. To the Americans, a Jeep was more than a machine. It was a sound, a presence. To imitate it was to misunderstand it. In occupied Burma, one extraordinary episode stood out. A Japanese engineering unit recovered a wrecked Jeep from a ravine, repaired it with hand tools, and used it to transport officers along jungle trails. The soldiers came to rely on it, naming it Yama no Oni, the mountain demon. When the war ended and Allied forces occupied the area, they found the Jeep still running. A red rising sun hastily painted over the white star on its hood. One British officer who saw it wrote in his diary, "It was almost poetic. The enemy had been driving the very spirit that defeated them." The Jeep's influence didn't stop when the fighting did. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces brought thousands more Jeeps into the country. They became the wheels of rebuilding, clearing rubble, carrying engineers, restoring power lines. For a nation once proud of its engineering discipline, it was humbling, yet it was also inspiring. Japanese industrialists studied the Jeep not as an enemy relic, but as a masterclass in efficient design. Mitsubishi, Toyota, and Nissan engineers all examined it closely in the late 1940s. Its straightforward engineering became the template for post-war Japanese utility vehicles. When Mitsubishi obtained a production license in 1953 to manufacture Willys Jeeps domestically, it was more than a business deal. It was a reconciliation. The very machine the empire once mocked now rolled proudly out of Japanese factories. Looking back, it's easy to see the irony and the poetry. The Willys Jeep had fought the Japanese across mountains, jungles, and islands. It had outlasted their tanks, outrun their trucks, and outsmarted their engineers. And in the end, it became one of Japan's own. The post-war Japanese Jeep was nearly identical to the wartime version. The same frame, the same Go Devil engine, even the same steering wheel design. For decades, these Jeeps would serve Japan's police, firefighters, and farmers, not as weapons, but as tools of peace. It was as if the machine had crossed from one world to another, from destroyer to rebuilder. For the soldiers who once fought against it, that transformation carried meaning. One Japanese veteran, interviewed years later, said softly, "We laughed at that little car. We thought it was foolish, but it never stopped. Even when our tanks burned, it kept moving. Now it helps rebuild the country we lost." That is a good ending. A good ending indeed. The Willys Jeep had done something extraordinary. It had crossed enemy lines not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. In a war defined by destruction, it showed both sides the power of simplicity, resilience, and design that served the human spirit. From battlefield to blueprint, from soldier to civilian, the lesson was the same. Strength is not in what a machine destroys, but in what it endures and what it can build after the smoke clears. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the Willys Jeep did not go home. It had no home to return to. It had crossed too many continents, seen too many faces, and carried too many memories. And so, instead of fading with the war, it began a new life, one not written in blood, but in dust, dirt, and rebuilding. In the ruins of Europe and Asia, thousands of Jeeps were left behind. They sat beside shattered bridges, airfields, and docks, dented, muddy, and exhausted. Yet they still ran. Their engines coughed to life even after months of neglect. Soldiers who were ordered to abandon them often refused. They drained the last drops of fuel and drove until the tanks were empty, unwilling to see the end of something that had carried them through so much. The Allied armies, recognizing their value, repurposed them instantly. In France, Britain, and Italy, Jeeps became reconstruction tools, clearing rubble, towing carts, and delivering food to starving towns. In the Pacific, they were used to carry medics into remote villages, and to help engineers rebuild the roads their tires had once destroyed. It was a quiet redemption. The same wheels that had carried war now carried recovery. In occupied Japan, Jeeps were everywhere. The U.S. forces used them as symbols of order and progress. Civilians who had once feared the sight of them now waved as they passed. Children ran alongside them through the streets of Tokyo and Yokohama, fascinated by the strange little cars that seemed indestructible. To a generation that had known only tanks, bayonets, and bombs, the Jeep became something different, a messenger of normal life. It ferried bread instead of bullets. It carried engineers, translators, and teachers. It was no longer a ghost of war, but the heartbeat of rebuilding. Back in America, Willys Overland faced a question. What do you do with a war hero? The answer came quickly. The company reimagined its creation for a new kind of mission: peace. In 1945, the first CJ, or civilian Jeep, rolled out of Toledo, Ohio. It looked nearly identical to its wartime brother, but now it wore brighter paint, simpler tires, and a new identity. The farmer's friend, the rancher's hand, the worker's tool. The advertisements showed Jeeps plowing fields, pulling hay wagons, climbing rocky mountain roads. The same virtues that made it unstoppable in combat, simplicity, strength, versatility, now became virtues for rebuilding a nation. Farmers loved it. Miners used it. Surveyors took it into wilderness no truck could reach. The Go Devil engine, once tuned for war, now hummed across the peaceful fields of Kansas and California. The Jeep had become part of America's peacetime mythology, a symbol of independence, resilience, and the open road. But the story didn't stop there. Around the world, surplus Jeeps were sold, shipped, or gifted to nations rebuilding after the war. France drove them through the Alps. Britain used them across its colonies. India, Burma, and the Philippines turned them into the first public vehicles on new roads. In some countries, they were transformed into taxis, fire engines, even wedding cars. In others, they became farm tools, hauling wood or water. The world was learning what the soldiers already knew, that a Jeep could become anything. In post-war Japan, the irony deepened. Mitsubishi, once a wartime manufacturer for the Imperial Navy, obtained a license to produce the Willys Jeep domestically in 1953. The first models rolled off Japanese assembly lines under the same name. Jeep, for the Japanese workers who built them, the sight was surreal. The vehicle that had symbolized defeat now represented renewal. The same hands that had forged warplanes now bolted together machines for peace. Mitsubishi would build Jeeps for the next 40 years. They became part of Japan's rural life, used by police, farmers, and forest rangers. To many, they were no longer American or Japanese. They were simply human, a tool that belonged to anyone who needed to go forward. The Jeep also conquered imagination. War photographers had immortalized it. Bouncing through shell fire, splattered in mud, silhouetted against sunsets. Those images carried into peacetime cinema and adventure stories. Soon, the Jeep stood for freedom itself. The open trail, the mountain road, the spirit that refuses to stop. Writers described it as a mechanical mule with the soul of a soldier. Travelers saw it as the bridge between civilization and the unknown. And so, what began as a military number, the Willys MB, became a cultural icon, as recognizable as the soldier's helmet or the waving flag. General Eisenhower once said that the Jeep, the C-47 transport aircraft, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war. But he might have added something else. The Jeep also won the peace. In towns scarred by bombing, it carried doctors. In countries divided by politics, it carried aid. In lands isolated by geography, It carried connection. No other vehicle had ever traveled from battlefield to back road with such grace. From the jungles of Burma to the boulevards of Paris, from the beaches of Iwo Jima to the snowfields of Norway. Wherever it went, it carried with it a quiet philosophy that strength lies in usefulness, not in might. Decades later, when the last veterans returned to the places where they had once fought, they sometimes found old jeeps rusting under trees. Their paint faded, their tires rotted, but their shape unmistakable. Some restored them, others simply touched them, saying nothing, because they knew this was not just metal. It was memory. The Jeep had carried their youth, their fear, and their hope. It had borne witness to the worst and best of humanity, and kept moving anyway. The post-war world would produce faster cars, stronger trucks, sleeker designs, but none would match the Willys Jeep's legacy. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to last, and it did. Every modern off-road vehicle, every Land Rover, every SUV, every trail-ready machine carries a piece of its DNA. The angles of its grille, the geometry of its stance, the philosophy of its endurance, all trace back to that unassuming shape, born from a 49-day deadline in 1940. By the time the century turned, millions of Jeeps had driven across the planet. They had explored jungles, deserts, and ice fields. They had fought wars, built cities, and climbed mountains. But their greatest achievement was invisible. They had taught humanity that utility, courage, and simplicity can outlast destruction. The Willys Jeep began as a tool of war. It became a symbol of freedom. And in the end, it reminded the world that the best machines, like the best men, are those that serve quietly, endure completely, and never stop moving forward. The war ended, the soldiers went home, and the world began to rebuild. Yet, across the quiet fields and forgotten roads of the world, one sound lingered, the steady hum of a small four-cylinder engine. It was the sound of the Willys Jeep, still moving, still doing what it was born to do. In Burma, vines grew over the tracks it once climbed. In the Philippines, rusting Jeeps lay half-buried beside coconut groves, their wheels turned toward the sky. On the beaches of the Pacific, the tide washed through open dashboards and silent steering wheels. But wherever it rested, the world remembered. Because in that humble shape, the slanted grille, the bare frame, the star on the hood, people saw more than metal. They saw motion. They saw the stubborn will of a free people. For the men who had driven it, the memory was personal. They remembered how it shook over rocks, how it groaned in low gear, how its headlights cut through monsoon rain like twin promises. They remembered leaning against its fenders after battle, the metal still warm, the silence heavy. Some swore they could still smell the mix of oil, gunpowder, and jungle air long after the war. To them, the Jeep wasn't an invention. It was a companion that had shared every fear, every road, every victory. Back home, when peace returned, veterans bought the new civilian Jeeps and drove them across farms and forests. They waved to neighbors, their children sitting where machine guns had once been mounted. And sometimes, when the wind was right, they heard the echo of the old engine and felt, for a moment, that the world they had fought for had been built on 4 small wheels. The Jeep had carried them through hell, and now it carried them home. The machine itself was modest, a 1/4 ton of steel, a few gears, a single light on each side. But its meaning was immense. It represented a kind of faith that transcended nations and wars, the belief that even the simplest creation, built with purpose and honesty, could change the course of history. It had no armor, yet it outlasted tanks. It had no wings, yet it conquered continents. It had no weapon, yet it helped win the greatest war humanity had ever fought. The Willys Jeep was not built to destroy. It was built to carry. And in doing so, it carried a nation's spirit farther than anyone thought possible. The irony of its journey is almost poetic. The Japanese soldiers who once laughed at it, calling it a toy, a farmer's cart, learned to respect it as the war dragged on. Some even rode in captured jeeps during their retreat, realizing too late that the little machine had done what their tanks could not. In the decades that followed, their country would build its own version, and with it, rebuild its identity. What began as mockery ended in admiration. The Jeep had bridged enemies not through diplomacy, but through example. Today, restored Willys Jeeps still drive in parades, their olive-drab paint glinting under modern sun. Old veterans sit behind the wheel, white-haired and quiet, their hands remembering the feel of the gear shift, the rhythm of the pedals. Crowds cheer them, but their eyes are far away, seeing jungle roads, muddy ridges, and faces long gone. For them, the Jeep is not nostalgia. It's remembrance, a reminder that history was written not only by great machines, but by small, steadfast ones. And for the world, the Jeep remains a symbol of endurance, a monument not cast in bronze or marble, but made of bolts and heart. It stands for the idea that freedom is not carried by giants, but by those who refuse to stop climbing. Every hill it conquered, every river it crossed, every life it saved added to that legacy. 1,000,000 small victories stitched together by one unstoppable engine. When the last Willys of the war generation finally falls silent, its echo will not fade. Because what it carried was larger than any army or flag. It carried ingenuity, courage, and the stubborn faith that humanity can always find a way forward. It carried messages, supplies, and wounded men, but also hope. It carried soldiers across mud, mountains, and oceans, but also carried them toward tomorrow. It carried a nation, and, in a way, it carried the world. In the end, it asked for nothing. No medals, no monuments, no glory. Only a little gasoline, a steady hand, and a road to follow. And when that road ended, in jungle, in sand, or in snow, it simply found another. The war gave the Willys Jeep a soul. Peace gave it meaning. And history gave it a truth that still endures. That greatness often comes in the smallest, simplest form. And that sometimes the mightiest thing a machine can do is carry us all the way home.